There is a very specific, highly dangerous misconception in suburban America that absolute power comes from a neighborhood title. People like Brenda genuinely believe that being elected president of the Homeowners Association makes them the sovereign ruler of a tiny, manicured kingdom. They patrol the sidewalks in the early morning with clipboards, leaving passive-aggressive notes on windshields, measuring the height of lawn grass with a literal ruler, and thriving on the pure intimidation of people who simply don't have the time, money, or energy to fight back. They rely on the fact that most normal citizens are terrified of legal threats. But Brenda made one catastrophic, life-altering miscalculation when she decided to target my property. She had absolutely no idea that I am a licensed civil engineer and a senior urban planner for the county government. I don't just read property laws and zoning regulations for a living. I am the person who literally writes the municipal infrastructure codes. She thought she was picking on a helpless new neighbor. Instead, she picked a fight with the architect of the system itself. It all started over a beautiful 6-foot white vinyl privacy fence I had professionally installed in my backyard. I had moved into the neighborhood exactly 3 months prior and simply wanted a safe, enclosed space for my rescue dog to run around. I pulled the standard HOA guidelines, saw that white vinyl was a pre-approved material, got the architectural committee's green light, and hired a highly reputable local crew. 2 days after the fence was finished, I came home from work to find a bright pink, aggressive violation notice aggressively taped to my front door. It was signed by Brenda. The citation claimed that my new fence was built exactly 3 inches outside of my designated property line, illegally encroaching on the community's common green space. The penalty listed at the bottom was a staggering $500 immediate fine, plus an additional compounding $500 for every single day the fence remained standing. She demanded I tear down the entire structure by the end of the week, or the daily fines would permanently attach to my mortgage. When I called Brenda the next morning to rationally discuss the notice, she didn't just refuse to listen, she practically gloated over the phone. She told me she had personally walked my property line with her own tape measure and visually confirmed the discrepancy. She smugly informed me that her HOA board had absolute zero tolerance for what she called land theft. She explicitly stated that if I didn't comply by Friday, she would hire an HOA-approved demolition contractor to rip the fence out with a bulldozer and send me the labor bill along with the thousands of dollars in accumulated fines. She spoke to me slowly, condescendingly, like I was a disobedient child who didn't understand how the real world worked. Normal homeowners would have panicked. They would have hired an expensive real estate lawyer, begged for an extension, or simply torn the fence down in tears to avoid losing their home. I didn't do any of that. I simply smiled, thanked her warmly for her intense diligence, and hung up the phone. I didn't need a lawyer. I had an advanced university degree in land surveying and unrestricted administrative access to the city's master infrastructure grid. The following morning, I didn't touch my fence, and I certainly didn't write a check for $500. Instead, I drove to my office at the municipal planning department, locked my door, and booted up the county's official, highly restricted geographic information system. I pulled the geolocated topography maps for the entire Oak Creek subdivision. I didn't just look at my specific house. I pulled the historical satellite data, the original developer blueprints from 20 years ago, and the municipal underground utility overlays. First, I confirmed what I mathematically already knew. My fence was perfectly legal. In fact, it was built exactly 4 inches safely inside my actual property line. Brenda hadn't used a professional, licensed surveyor. She had just guessed the boundary line based on the position of an old landscaping rock. But while I had the neighborhood maps open on my massive dual monitors, my eyes naturally drifted over to Brenda's property. She lived on the largest corner lot in the subdivision, and her backyard featured a massive, brand-new luxury swimming pool with a sprawling, custom-stamped concrete patio. I clicked a single button and overlaid the city's hidden utility map directly onto Brenda's parcel. When the lines rendered on my screen, my jaw practically hit the floor. In urban engineering, there is something called a municipal utility easement. It is a strictly enforced, legally binding strip of land where the city's critical underground infrastructure runs. You cannot, under any circumstances, build permanent structures on an easement because the city needs immediate, unobstructed access in case of an emergency repair. Brenda's spectacular, custom-built $80,000 swimming pool was sitting directly on top of the neighborhood's primary 24-inch pressurized municipal water main. It was a massive, catastrophic building code violation. She had completely bypassed the city permitting office, likely using her unchallenged HOA authority to fast-track the construction without a single legal inspection. She wanted to financially ruin me over 3 imaginary inches of grass, while she was illegally squatting on a critical piece of city infrastructure. I didn't confront her. I didn't send a warning email or try to negotiate. I let the federal and municipal traps snap shut entirely by the book. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a thick, undeniable dossier containing the satellite overlays, the original county zoning laws, and the underground utility blueprints. Then, I bypassed the neighborhood drama entirely and made a direct phone call to the Director of City Code Enforcement, a man I had worked alongside for the last decade. I also sent a highly urgent, red-flagged operational memo to the City Water Department, reporting a severe, critical structural weight risk to the primary water main in the Oak Creek subdivision. The response from the city was not a polite warning letter sent in the mail. When major municipal water infrastructure is physically threatened by thousands of gallons of pool water and heavy concrete, the government does not negotiate, and they do not care who the HOA President is. They act with immediate, overwhelming, and devastating legal authority. 3 days later, I was sitting quietly on my front porch drinking a cup of coffee when the heavy machinery arrived. It wasn't an HOA landscaping crew coming for my fence. It was a loud, ground-shaking fleet of massive yellow city excavators and 4 official code enforcement vehicles with their amber lights flashing. They drove right past my perfectly legal white vinyl fence and parked directly on Brenda's pristine, manicured front lawn. I watched from a distance as Brenda ran out of her front door in her bathrobe, frantically waving her clipboard and screaming at the city workers that they were trespassing on private property. The lead city inspector didn't even flinch. He calmly handed her a mandatory, unappealable municipal demolition order. Because she had built an illegal, unpermitted structure over a critical city water main, the city was exercising its absolute legal right-of-way. Right before my eyes, the massive steel bucket of the excavator slammed down, shattering Brenda's expensive concrete patio and violently ripping a massive hole straight into the side of her $80,000 luxury pool. Water flooded her yard as she fell to her knees, screaming. She was forced to watch her ultimate status symbol get completely destroyed and filled with dirt, all while being legally slapped with tens of thousands of dollars in city remediation fines. She lost her pool, her savings, and ultimately her position as HOA President. And my fence? It is still standing exactly where I built it. You would think that watching a 20-ton yellow city excavator violently smash your $80,000 luxury swimming pool into a pile of jagged concrete and mud would be a humbling experience. For a normal human being, it would be a devastating wake-up call. But Brenda was not a normal human being. She was a petty suburban dictator who had just been publicly humiliated in front of her entire neighborhood, and her fragile ego completely shattered her grip on reality. Instead of accepting her massive legal and financial losses, stepping down from the HOA board, and apologizing to the community, she decided to double down. She didn't just declare war on me, she declared war on the entire municipal government, and she was arrogant enough to try and use the neighborhood's money to fund her absolute delusions. The morning after the demolition, the massive crater in Brenda's backyard was still filled with muddy water and broken rebar. The city inspectors had wrapped her property in bright yellow caution tape and explicitly ordered her not to touch the utility access point. I was pulling out of my driveway to head to the county planning office when I noticed a flurry of activity. Brenda was marching up and down the street, flanked by the two other HOA board members, aggressively shoving envelopes into every single mailbox in the subdivision. When I got to my office, I opened the envelope she had left for me. It was an emergency, mandatory special assessment notice. According to the deeply unhinged letter, the city's demolition of her pool was an illegal act of government overreach and a coordinated sabotage orchestrated by a, quote, malicious new resident, unquote. She announced that the HOA was officially retaining a high-priced corporate litigation firm to sue the city water department. To pay for this massive, ridiculous legal battle, Brenda had single-handedly authorized a mandatory special assessment of $1,000 for every single home in the neighborhood, due in 14 days. Furthermore, nestled at the bottom of the letter was a specific clause directed entirely at me. Because she blamed me for tipping off the city, she had officially levied a $10,000 punitive fine against my property for destructive interference with community harmony. She threatened that if I didn't pay it immediately, she would initiate foreclosure proceedings on my house. She was trying to make my neighbors pay for her illegal construction, and she was trying to steal my house to cover her personal city fines. I sat at my desk at the municipal planning department, looking at this piece of paper, and I actually had to laugh out loud. Brenda fundamentally did not understand the battlefield she had just stepped onto. She was trying to fight a war of attrition using neighborhood bylaws, while I possessed the entire bureaucratic arsenal of the county government. By officially involving the HOA in a legal dispute against the city's infrastructure division, she had just crossed a massive, dangerous legal line. She had turned a personal zoning violation into a corporate legal matter involving public utilities. I walked down the hall to the legal department and handed Brenda's extortion letter directly to the chief municipal attorney. His eyes widened as he read the threat of an HOA suing the city over a strictly enforced, federally mandated water main easement. He didn't just laugh. He immediately drafted a cease and desist order that essentially told the HOA they were bordering on criminal extortion. But I wasn't finished. Brenda was using her loyal board members as a shield to pass these insane financial assessments. If they wanted to stand blindly behind a woman who built a concrete pool over a pressurized water main, they were about to suffer the exact same level of brutal municipal scrutiny. I went back to my terminal, logged into the restricted engineering grid, and pulled the property files for the other two HOA board members. Brenda's primary enforcer was a man named Greg, the HOA treasurer, who lived 3 houses down from me. I pulled his original property survey and cross-referenced it with the high-resolution satellite imagery from the current year. Greg had recently constructed a massive 2-story detached garage and a mother-in-law suite in his backyard. It looked beautiful from the street, but on the county zoning map, his property was strictly coded as R1 single-family residential. You legally cannot build a secondary dwelling unit on an R1 lot without applying for a highly specific zoning variance, undergoing 4 separate structural inspections, and paying thousands in commercial permit fees. I checked the municipal permit registry. Greg hadn't filed a single piece of paperwork. The entire 2-story structure, fully wired with electricity and plumbing, was entirely black market construction. It was a massive fire hazard and a blatant violation of county tax assessments. Brenda wanted to use Greg to help her steal my house over a 3-inch fence dispute. She had no idea I was about to drop the full, crushing weight of the city building inspector directly onto his illegal guest house. I printed Greg's unpermitted construction evidence, placed it in a crisp manila folder, and prepared to introduce the HOA treasurer to the brutal reality of municipal law. I did not mail the manila folder to Greg. When you are dealing with unpermitted black market construction that includes unauthorized plumbing and electrical wiring, you don't send a polite warning letter. You escalate the issue to the people who handle life safety hazards. I took the satellite imagery, the property line overlays, and the distinct lack of municipal permits directly to the county fire marshal and the Department of Residential Code Compliance. In the world of urban planning, an unpermitted secondary dwelling isn't just a zoning violation. It is considered an imminent structural fire threat. If a poorly wired electrical panel in an illegal garage sparks a fire, it can burn down adjacent homes before the fire department even knows the structure exists. The municipal response was even faster than the strike on Brenda's pool. At 8 o'clock the next morning, a bright red fire department command SUV and 2 municipal code enforcement trucks aggressively pulled up to Greg's house. They didn't knock on his front door to ask for permission. The fire marshal and 3 heavily geared inspectors walked straight up his driveway and completely surrounded the illegal 2-story guest house. I was backing out of my driveway to head to work, and I paused just long enough to watch the absolute panic unfold. Greg came sprinting out of his house, his tie half knotted, frantically waving his arms and demanding to know what was going on. The fire marshal didn't entertain a single second of Greg's HOA entitlement. He bluntly informed Greg that because the structure had illegal, uninspected electrical tie-ins to the main municipal grid, it was officially classified as a critical hazard. Right in front of Greg's horrified eyes, a technician from the city utility company walked over to the side of the illegal garage with a pair of heavy bolt cutters and physically severed the main power line, killing the electricity to the entire structure. The lead inspector then pulled out a roll of heavy neon red tape and slapped a massive, condemned "Do Not Enter" sticker directly across the front door of the guest house. Greg was handed a citation that made Brenda's fines look like spare change. He was hit with a $25,000 penalty for illegal commercial construction, and he was given exactly 30 days to either pull the proper permits, hire commercial architects to rip open the walls for a retroactive inspection, or tear the entire 2-story building down to the foundation at his own expense. Unlike Brenda, Greg did not have a fragile, delusional ego to protect. He was a coward who had only joined the HOA board to feel important. The moment he realized that blindly following Brenda into a war against the city had just cost him his $50,000 man cave and put him in the crosshairs of the fire marshal, he completely broke. By noon that same day, an urgent, frantic email was blasted out to the entire neighborhood mailing list. It was Greg's official resignation from the HOA board. He didn't just quit, he publicly threw Brenda under the bus, explicitly stating that he completely disagreed with her illegal special assessment and wanted absolutely zero part in any lawsuit against the municipal government. Brenda's shield was cracking. She had lost her primary enforcer, but she still had one loyal foot soldier left, the HOA secretary, a woman named Martha. Martha was Brenda's closest friend in the neighborhood, and the person who had physically drafted and signed the ridiculous $10,000 punitive fine against my property. If I was going to completely dismantle Brenda's corrupt regime, I couldn't leave Martha on the board to blindly approve her psychotic agendas. I needed to isolate Brenda entirely. When I returned to my office that afternoon, I sat back down at my geographic information terminal and pulled Martha's property parcel. Martha lived at the very end of the subdivision, on a beautiful, sprawling lot that backed directly up to the community's large retention pond. To the untrained eye, it was just a nice house with a great waterfront view. But to a senior urban planner, waterfront property is a highly regulated, mathematically precise jurisdictional nightmare. I overlaid the federal topographical map onto Martha's backyard. The retention pond wasn't just a neighborhood water feature, it was officially classified by the government as a protected municipal wetland buffer zone. These zones are heavily protected to prevent toxic runoff and localized flooding. You absolutely cannot alter the landscape within 50 feet of the water's edge. I zoomed in on the high-resolution satellite imagery of Martha's backyard from 3 years ago, and then seamlessly cross-referenced it with the aerial pass from last month. A cold, victorious smile spread across my face. Martha hadn't just planted a few illegal flowers, she had hired a heavy landscaping crew to illegally dredge the protected shoreline, dumping tons of unapproved soil and retaining rocks directly into the water to artificially expand her backyard by nearly 20 feet. She had built a massive, unpermitted wooden viewing deck that extended directly out over the protected water. Brenda and Greg had violated city codes, but Martha had done something infinitely worse. By dredging and altering a protected wetland buffer to make her garden look prettier, Martha hadn't just broken a local zoning rule, she had violated the Federal Clean Water Act. And the Department of Environmental Protection does not issue simple warning tickets. They calculate their fines by the square foot per day, dating back to the exact moment the environmental destruction began. If there is one entity in the United States government that you never, ever want to draw the attention of, it is the Army Corps of Engineers working in tandem with the Environmental Protection Agency. City code inspectors will fine you. The fire marshal will condemn your building, but the federal government will absolutely bankrupt you to protect a wetland. Martha had no idea that her beautiful, artificial shoreline expansion was a catastrophic violation of federal ecological law. She had built her custom viewing deck directly over a protected spawning habitat. I didn't bother calling the local authorities for this one. I compiled a rigorous, heavily documented ecological impact report. I used the county's historical topography maps to show the exact cubic tonnage of soil and rock Martha had illegally dumped into the retention pond. I included the before and after high-resolution satellite imagery, clearly highlighting the unpermitted wooden deck extending over the water. Then, I forwarded the entire dossier directly to the regional director of the EPA's Watershed Protection Division. Federal agencies do not move as fast as local city trucks, but when they finally do move, the sheer force of their authority is terrifying. A week after Greg's illegal garage was condemned, a convoy of 3 pristine white SUVs with federal government license plates quietly pulled up to Martha's waterfront property. Men and women wearing official windbreakers, carrying highly specialized surveying equipment, and water testing kits swarmed her backyard. I wasn't there to watch it happen, but the details spread through the neighborhood gossip network faster than a wildfire. The federal agents didn't just write Martha a ticket, they issued an immediate federal cease and desist order and hit her with a devastating ecological remediation mandate. Under the Clean Water Act, the EPA doesn't just fine you for the damage, they legally force you to restore the protected ecosystem to its exact original state at your own expense. Martha wasn't just ordered to tear down her expensive wooden deck, she was legally compelled to hire a highly specialized, insanely expensive environmental engineering firm to safely dredge all the illegal soil out of the pond, replant specific native aquatic vegetation, and stabilize the shoreline. The estimated cost for the mandatory ecological restoration was well over $90,000. If she didn't comply within 60 days, the federal government would place a lien on her property and seek criminal charges for environmental destruction. Just like Greg, Martha completely shattered under the immense pressure. The reality of facing federal bankruptcy over a backyard deck destroyed any loyalty she had left for Brenda. Later that evening, the entire subdivision received another frantic, emotionally unhinged email. It was Martha's official resignation from the HOA board. She explicitly stated she was facing financial ruin, completely withdrew her signature from my ridiculous $10,000 fine, and begged the neighborhood for forgiveness. In less than 2 weeks, I had completely neutralized Brenda's entire command structure. Greg was gone, facing the demolition of his guest house. Martha was gone, facing federal ecological fines. Brenda was now the sole remaining member of the Homeowners Association board. Under our community bylaws, a single board member cannot establish a legal quorum. This meant she had absolutely zero legal authority to pass her mandatory $1,000 special assessment to sue the city. And she had no legal standing to enforce the fines against my property. The HOA, as a governing body, was effectively paralyzed. I had surgically dismantled her entire regime, using nothing but public records and municipal code. Any rational person would have looked at the absolute devastation surrounding them, realized they had picked a fight with a ghost they couldn't see, and surrendered. But Brenda was completely consumed by blind, venomous rage. Her $80,000 pool was a crater of jagged concrete. Her friends had abandoned her. Her power was entirely gone. In her mind, I wasn't just a neighbor who refused to pay a fence fine. I was the architect of her complete destruction. With her legal avenues entirely cut off and her corporate shield shattered, Brenda's fragile grip on sanity finally snapped. She decided that if she couldn't use the HOA to destroy me legally, she was going to destroy me physically. It happened at exactly 2:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was fast asleep when my phone on the nightstand suddenly vibrated violently. It was an automated motion detection alert from the high-definition security camera mounted on my back patio. I grabbed my phone, instantly wide awake, and opened the live feed. Through the grainy night vision lens, I watched an absolute nightmare unfolding in my backyard. It was Brenda. She was dressed in all black, standing at the edge of my property line, and she was holding a massive, heavy-duty steel sledgehammer. Through the glowing screen of my phone, I watched in absolute disbelief as Brenda raised the heavy steel sledgehammer over her head and brought it violently down onto the top rail of my pristine white vinyl fence. The microphone on the camera picked up the sharp, explosive crack of the vinyl shattering in the dead of night. She didn't stop. She was swinging with a chaotic, unhinged fury, completely out of breath, smashing the pristine panels into jagged plastic shards. She wasn't just trying to damage the fence, she was trying to physically erase the structure that had initiated her spectacular downfall. She had lost her mind, her pool, and her power, and now she was committing a felony property crime on high-definition video. A normal homeowner would have thrown open the back door, turned on the floodlights, and started screaming at her. But I am not a normal homeowner, and I never interrupt an enemy while they are actively destroying their own life. If I confronted her, it would become a messy neighbor dispute. If the police caught her in the act, it was a severe criminal offense. I stayed in the dark bedroom, kept the live video feed recording to the cloud, and calmly dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, I didn't say my neighbor was breaking my fence. I used highly specific, legally triggering language that guarantees a rapid, high-priority law enforcement response. I stated clearly that there was an unidentified intruder dressed in dark clothing actively destroying my property with a heavy steel weapon, and that I was trapped inside my home and feared for my immediate safety. Within 4 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers silently illuminated my street. They had cut their sirens a block away to avoid spooking the intruder. I watched from the safety of my second-story window as 4 armed police officers quietly unlatched my side gate and moved tactically into the backyard. Brenda was so consumed by her psychotic, sledgehammer-swinging rage that she didn't even hear them approach. She was mid-swing, panting heavily, surrounded by the shattered ruins of 3 fence panels. Suddenly, 4 blinding tactical flashlights ignited simultaneously, locking her entirely in a harsh, inescapable spotlight. Drop the weapon right now, and put your hands on your head," the lead officer roared, his voice echoing like a gunshot through the silent suburban neighborhood. Brenda froze. She dropped the heavy sledgehammer into the grass with a dull thud, but her deeply ingrained delusional suburban entitlement hadn't completely worn off yet. Instead of immediately complying with the armed officers, she actually tried to use her non-existent authority. She raised a hand to block the blinding light and yelled back at the police, her voice shrill and commanding. She told them to turn their lights off. She proudly announced that she was Brenda Vance, the president of the Homeowners Association, and that she was legally executing an authorized demolition of a non-compliant structure. The police officers were absolutely baffled. They were staring at a 50-something woman dressed in black sweatpants, covered in vinyl dust, trying to pull rank on the municipal police department at 2 o'clock in the morning while standing in the middle of a destroyed fence. The lead officer didn't care about HOA bylaws. He cared about the criminal code. He closed the distance in 3 massive strides, grabbed Brenda by the arm, spun her around, and slammed her face first into the remaining unbroken section of my fence. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed through my backyard. As they patted her down and read her Miranda rights, Brenda finally realized the horrific reality of her situation. She wasn't dealing with terrified homeowners anymore. She was dealing with the criminal justice system. She started sobbing hysterically, begging the officers to let her go, screaming that it was all my fault and that I had ruined her life. They didn't listen. They marched her out of my backyard in handcuffs, placed her in the back of a squad car, and drove her straight to the county jail. She was officially booked on charges of felony vandalism, armed destruction of private property, and criminal trespassing. Because the damage to my custom fence exceeded $2,000, the vandalism charge was elevated to a Class 6 felony. The next morning, I walked out to my backyard with a cup of coffee to inspect the damage. 3 panels were completely obliterated, but it was the best money I had ever spent. Brenda was currently sitting in a concrete holding cell, waiting to see a magistrate judge to set her bail. But as I stood there looking at the broken plastic, a sudden chilling realization hit me. Brenda was facing massive city fines for her illegal pool. She was facing a costly criminal defense for felony vandalism. She desperately needed cash. I remembered the unhinged letter she had shoved into my mailbox days earlier, the one where she claimed she had single-handedly authorized a special assessment and retained a high-priced corporate litigation firm on behalf of the HOA. With Greg and Martha gone, Brenda had been the sole signatory on the HOA's operating bank account for the last 48 hours. I rushed back inside and immediately drafted an emergency legal injunction. If Brenda was crazy enough to attack my house with a sledgehammer, she was absolutely desperate enough to embezzle the neighborhood's mandatory reserve funds to pay her criminal bail and her defense attorneys. I hadn't just defeated a corrupt HOA president, I had cornered a desperate, dangerous criminal, and I needed to lock down the neighborhood's money before she drained the accounts entirely dry. To stop a desperate person from stealing money, you have to move faster than the banking system. At 8 o'clock that morning, while Brenda was sitting in a county holding cell waiting for her arraignment, I was sitting in the office of the chief municipal attorney, the same man who had laughed at Brenda's ridiculous threat to sue the city just a few days prior. I laid out the timeline: the destruction of the city water main, the collapse of the HOA quorum, the felony vandalism of my property, and my massive, immediate concern regarding the community's financial reserves. Because Brenda was now the sole remaining board member, she had unchecked unilateral access to the neighborhood's escrow accounts, which held over $150,000 in our collected dues. The chief attorney didn't hesitate. Because an HOA is legally structured as a nonprofit corporation, operating without a quorum is a direct violation of state corporate law. He immediately helped me draft an ex parte emergency injunction to freeze the HOA's financial assets, citing extreme fiduciary risk and the pending criminal charges against the sole acting director. A municipal judge signed the order in less than 30 minutes. With the ink still wet on the court order, I drove directly to the local branch of the bank that held the HOA's accounts. I bypassed the tellers, walked straight into the branch manager's office, and handed him the signed federal injunction. He immediately pulled up the HOA's ledger on his terminal. The blood drained from his face as he looked at the screen. He turned the monitor around so I could see it. I was not just being paranoid. I was off by a matter of hours. At exactly 1:15 in the morning, barely an hour before Brenda had marched into my backyard with a sledgehammer, she had logged into the HOA banking portal and initiated a massive, unauthorized wire transfer. She had attempted to move $35,000 of community reserve funds into a private trust account belonging to a high-profile local criminal defense attorney. She knew she was going to do something completely unhinged to my property, and she had preemptively embezzled our neighborhood's money to pay for her own criminal defense retainer. Because wire transfers take 24 hours to clear the Federal Reserve, the money was still in a pending status. The branch manager immediately canceled the transaction, locked down the accounts, and forwarded the digital footprint of the wire transfer directly to the county prosecutor's office. Brenda hadn't just committed a Class 6 felony for vandalism. She had just handed the district attorney a slam-dunk case for corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud. That evening, I organized an emergency town hall meeting right in my own driveway. I didn't need to send out official letters. The sight of 4 police cars in my backyard and the massive city excavator sitting on Brenda's ruined lawn was enough to draw nearly every single homeowner in the subdivision. Standing in front of the shattered remains of my vinyl fence, I laid out the entire horrific truth. I showed them the city code violations, the federal ecological fines that Martha had incurred, and Greg's condemned property. Finally, I held up the bank statement proving that Brenda had tried to steal $35,000 of their hard-earned money to fund her criminal rampage. The neighborhood was absolutely outraged. On the spot, we held an emergency, unanimous vote of no confidence. We legally dissolved the existing HOA board, permanently stripped Brenda of her title as president, and appointed a temporary transition committee to audit the remaining funds. Brenda's tiny, manicured kingdom was officially burned to the ground. She was no longer the president of anything. 2 days later, Brenda was finally granted a bail hearing. Because her accounts were frozen and the embezzled funds were clawed back, she had to use a predatory bail bondsman, putting her own house up as collateral just to secure her release. She was ordered to wear a GPS ankle monitor and commanded by the judge to have absolutely zero contact with me or my property. I was sitting on my front porch when her Uber pulled up to her house. She stepped out of the car looking completely defeated. She was wearing the same black sweatpants she had been arrested in. Her hair was a mess, and the heavy black GPS monitor was clearly visible around her ankle. She looked over at me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of hatred and absolute despair. She thought she was returning to the one safe haven she had left, her beautiful, massive corner lot home. She thought she could lock her doors, hide from the neighborhood, and figure out a way to survive the impending criminal trials. But as she walked up her driveway, she completely froze. Taped to her custom mahogany front door was a massive, bright orange legal notice, and sticking out of her mailbox was a certified letter from her mortgage lender. Brenda had forgotten the ultimate golden rule of homeownership. When you intentionally build an $80,000 illegal structure over a municipal water main, the city doesn't just smash it with an excavator. They make one very specific phone call, and that phone call was about to leave her completely, hopelessly homeless. When you secure a mortgage for a $500,000 suburban home, you sign a very thick stack of legal documents containing a multitude of strict clauses designed to protect the bank's investment. 2 of the most critical requirements are that you must maintain comprehensive homeowners insurance, and you absolutely cannot conduct unpermitted, illegal construction that results in massive municipal liens against the property. When the city code enforcement demolished Brenda's $80,000 pool, they didn't just walk away. They officially filed a massive $60,000 remediation lien against her deed for the destruction of the municipal utility easement. And when a city files a property lien of that magnitude, an automated alert is immediately sent to the homeowner's insurance provider and the mortgage lender. The bright orange paper taped to Brenda's door was a formal notice of cancellation from her insurance company. Because she had deliberately built an illegal structure over a pressurized public water main, she had voided her policy under the gross negligence clause. They dropped her coverage immediately. The certified letter sticking out of her mailbox was from the bank holding her mortgage, and it was the final, devastating nail in her coffin. Because she no longer had insurance, and because the city had placed a massive lien on the property, she was in critical default of her loan terms. The bank had legally triggered what is known in real estate as an acceleration clause. They weren't asking her to catch up on a missed payment. They were demanding the immediate, full repayment of the entire remaining balance of her mortgage, over $400,000, within 30 days. If she failed to pay, they would seize the house. Brenda had no money. Her accounts were frozen. Her savings were destroyed, and whatever equity she had left in the house was about to be seized by the bail bondsman to cover her felony release. I watched from my porch as she tore open the certified letter, read the first paragraph, and physically collapsed onto her front steps. She dropped her head into her hands and sobbed, a hollow, echoing sound of total, inescapable defeat. She had spent years using neighborhood bylaws to terrorize her neighbors over unapproved paint colors and parked cars. Now, the actual terrifying machinery of the real world had turned its gaze onto her, and it crushed her into absolute dust in less than a month. The foreclosure process was incredibly fast. Because Brenda was facing multiple felony charges for the sledgehammer attack on my fence, plus the impending federal wire fraud investigation for attempting to embezzle the HOA reserve funds, she didn't even have the legal or financial capacity to fight the bank. She surrendered the deed in lieu of foreclosure just to avoid another massive civil lawsuit. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, a beat-up rented moving van backed into her driveway. There were no professional movers this time, just Brenda, wearing a faded t-shirt and her GPS ankle monitor, silently loading cardboard boxes into the back of the truck by herself. Not a single neighbor came out to help her. Not Greg, who was currently paying a commercial crew to tear down his illegal guest house. Not Martha, who was liquidating her retirement accounts to pay the EPA to dredge her backyard. Brenda loaded her final box, closed the rolling door of the truck, and drove out of the subdivision forever. Our neighborhood changed almost overnight. With the toxic, corrupt regime completely eradicated, the community felt like it could finally breathe. The Temporary Transition Committee, which I legally advised, completely rewrote the HOA bylaws. We stripped away the board's power to issue arbitrary fines, disbanded the Architectural Review Committee, and reduced our monthly dues to a fraction of what they used to be, just enough to cover the landscaping of the front entrance and the communal insurance policy. The neighborhood reserve funds, securely locked away from any single person's control, were used to actually improve the community. As for me, I hired the exact same reputable local crew to come back and repair my fence. They replaced the shattered panels, reinforced the posts, and even gave me a steep discount because they had heard the legendary story of what happened to the woman who smashed it. I was sitting on my back patio a few months later, drinking a cup of coffee and watching my rescue dog happily running around the fully enclosed, perfectly legal yard. I looked at the pristine white vinyl of the fence, standing exactly where it had always been, perfectly aligned 4 inches inside my property boundary. Brenda Vance thought her title as HOA President gave her the right to act like a god. She thought she could extort me, intimidate me, and bend reality to fit her petty, vindictive rules. She tried to financially ruin me over 3 imaginary inches of grass. So I used my degree, my keyboard, and the United States government to legally obliterate her entire existence. She wanted 3 inches of my yard. I took her $80,000 pool, her freedom, and her home. In the world of urban planning, we have a very specific rule. Never build on a foundation of lies, because eventually, the city will always come to inspect the concrete.